The Texas Panhandle, 1873. Wind scraped raw earth, carrying the grit of 1,000 miles and the silence of a man alone. Silas Thorne stood on his sagging porch, the vast emptiness of the Iron Creek ranch stretching before him, a kingdom of dust, dying grass, and ghosts. His leg ached with the old war wound, a constant companion to the hollowness inside. Cattle grew thin, fences sagged, and the weight of it all bowed his shoulders like a drought-stricken oak. Then, a smudge on the horizon. Not a rider he knew, a figure small against the immensity, approaching with the weary determination of someone who knew hard roads. As the horse drew closer, Silas squinted. Not a man, a woman, young, saddle-worn, her eyes holding a story as deep and uncharted as the plains themselves. Why was she here? What desperate gamble brought a woman to his failing doorstep? The silence deepened, thick with unspoken questions and the fragile, terrifying possibility of change. Silas Thorne watched the rider until the figure dissolved into the heat shimmer near the horizon line, heading towards town. Another hand quitting. Young Jimmy Carter, barely 18, couldn't stomach the isolation, the relentless work, the specter of failure that clung to Iron Creek like the alkali dust. Silas didn't blame him. He turned, the worn wood of the porch groaning under his uneven step. The legacy of Shiloh, a Confederate mini-ball that had shattered bone and ambition alike. The screen door slapped shut behind him, the sound echoing in the cavernous emptiness of the ranch house. Too big for one man, built for a family, a future that had crumbled with the Confederacy and bled out in the red Georgia mud. Outside, the wind was a living thing. It moaned around the eaves, lifted veils of fine, pale dirt from the corral, and carried the faint, anxious lowing of the herd gathered near the dwindling creek. Too many cattle for the sparse grass. Not enough hands to push them towards better pasture, even if he knew where that mythical land existed this parched summer. The war had taken the men, the dreams, and now the land itself seemed determined to finish the job. Rustlers, emboldened by the emptiness, had picked off stragglers twice in the past month. Silas felt the weight like a physical chain. The mortgage held by the stern-faced banker in Amarillo, the dwindling coin in the strongbox beneath a loose floorboard, the sheer, exhausting size of it all pressing down. He spent the afternoon wrestling with a broken windmill pump, the metal hot under his calloused hands, sweat stinging his eyes and tracing paths through the grime on his face. The futility of it gnawed at him. Every repaired thing seemed to spawn 2 new breaks. He leaned against the stubborn mechanism, breathing hard, the ache in his leg a dull throb. He needed help, strong help, willing help. Men were scarce, drifting towards the railroads or the mines, or demanding wages he couldn't meet. The advertisement he'd reluctantly tacked up in Clayton's Mercantile last week felt like an exercise in humiliation. Help wanted. Cattle. Iron Creek. Fair pay. Apply S. Thorne. Fair pay was a lie stretched thinner than the creek water. The lowering sun painted the plains in shades of ochre and bruised purple when he saw the dust again. Not from the town road this time, but cutting across the open range, a direct line towards the house. 1 horse. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers, a knot of wary apprehension tightening in his gut. Strangers out here rarely brought good news. He walked to the porch edge, hand resting near the worn butt of the colt on his hip, squinting against the glare. The horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a sweat-darkened coat, pulled up at the hitching post. The rider dismounted with a fluid grace that belied any obvious fatigue. Silas took her in. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, but her face held a seriousness that spoke of years lived hard. Sun-brown skin, high cheekbones, eyes a startlingly clear gray, like quartz washed in a mountain stream. Her clothes were practical, a faded blue shirt, men's trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a worn duster coat tied behind the saddle. Her dark hair, escaping a braid, was dusted with the same fine powder that covered everything. She carried herself with a quiet stillness, neither cowed nor challenging, simply present. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was low, calm, carrying easily over the wind's whine. No trace of the simpering deference or nervousness he might have expected from a woman riding alone onto a strange man's ranch. "That's me." Silas kept his voice neutral, guarded. He noted the rifle scabbard on her saddle, the well-cared-for leather of her gear. She looked capable, but appearances could deceive. "What brings you out?" She met his gaze directly. "Saw your notice. In Clayton. For the cattle job." She gestured vaguely towards the distant cluster of buildings. Silas blinked. He'd expected many things. A drifter looking for a meal, a messenger about rustlers, maybe even the banker's man come to check on his investment. Not this. Certainly not a woman answering the call for backbreaking cattle work. A disbelieving snort escaped him before he could stop it. "The notice was for a hand, miss. Ranch work. Hard work. Sunup to sundown. I can work." Her statement was simple, factual. No boast, no plea. Her gray eyes didn't waver. "It's not women's work," Silas stated, the words feeling clumsy and automatic, echoing sentiments he'd heard all his life but rarely considered deeply until this moment. Breaking horses, mending fence in this heat, riding line for strays or sign of trouble. It's a man's burden out here. A flicker of something passed over her face. Not anger, but a cool assessment. "Burden needs lifting, Mr. Thorne, regardless of who carries it. Your fences are down south of the Salt Lick. Windmills throwing a bearing. Creeks low, herds restless. Needs pushing towards the high ground north, where the mesquite's holding some green." She nodded towards the distant, slightly darker smudge on the horizon. 3 days, maybe 4, hard riding. Silas stared. She'd observed more in her approach than he'd realized. The accuracy, the quiet authority in her assessment threw him. "You sound like you know cattle. Been around them." Her answer was deliberately vague. She patted the bay's neck. "I can ride, tend, mend, shoot straight if need be." She paused, then added the necessary weight. "I need the work. Pays fair, you said." The word fair hung between them, an accusation. He couldn't pay a top hand's wages. Could he pay a woman for this? The sheer impracticality warred with his desperation. The image of Jimmy Carter riding away, the memory of missing calves, the groan of the windmill pump, they pressed in. He glanced towards the corral, where his own 2 remaining horses stood listlessly. One was the old plow horse, Daisy. The other was Diablo, a raw-boned, hammer-headed sorrel he bought cheap off a trail drive. The horse had spirit, too much of it, and a mean streak Silas hadn't had the time or patience to break. No one else on the place could handle him. "Can you handle a green horse?" The question was out before he fully considered it. A challenge born of skepticism and a perverse need to test her claim. Her gaze followed his to the sorrel, who pinned his ears back and pawed the dusty ground. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Not warm, but knowing. Some need handling. Some just need understanding. Silas grunted, unconvinced. Understanding didn't mend fences or move cattle. But the light was fading, and the problem of help remained, vast and unsolved. His options were non-existent. "Name?" "Cora Vance." "Well, Miss Vance," Silas said, the title feeling foreign on his tongue, addressing someone dressed like a wrangler, suppers beans and salt pork. "Bunkhouse is empty. You can bed down there tonight." It wasn't an acceptance, not quite, but it wasn't a refusal. A temporary reprieve for them both. "We'll talk terms in the morning. See if you're still of a mind after a night listening to this wind howl." Cora simply nodded, a single decisive dip of her chin. "Appreciate it, Mr. Thorne." She led her bay towards the water trough, movements economical and unhurried. Silas watched her go, the strange figure already becoming part of the fading twilight landscape of his failing ranch. He felt a confusing mix of relief at having another body, however unexpected, and a profound unease. Hiring a woman? The talk in Clayton would be merciless. And what could she truly do? The weight on his shoulders hadn't lessened. It had just taken on a different, more uncertain shape. Dawn came sharp and unforgiving, the sun a brass coin burning through the thin, high-altitude air. Silas was already at the corral, the sour smell of old hay and horse sweat thick in the cool morning. Diablo circled the enclosure like a caged wolf, snorting, tossing his head, his eyes showing white rim. Silas needed to check the north fence line, a 10-mile ride. Daisy was reliable, but slow. Diablo was fast, strong, and potentially disastrous. He'd managed the horse himself a few times, but it was always a battle, exhausting him before the real work began. He'd resigned himself to Daisy's plodding pace when the bunkhouse door creaked open. Cora Vance stepped out. She'd washed the dust from her face, her braid neat and tight. She wore the same practical clothes, but they looked crisp in the morning light. She carried a coiled rope. Her gaze went immediately to Diablo, then to Silas, understanding dawning in those clear gray eyes. Heading out, she asked, her voice calm in the quiet morning. North fence, Silas confirmed, gesturing vaguely. Needs checking after last night's wind. Cora walked to the corral fence, resting her forearms on the top rail. She watched the sorrel, not with the wary tension Silas felt, but with a focused stillness. Diablo stopped his pacing, sensing a new presence. He turned his massive head towards her, ears flicking forward then back, nostrils flaring as he sampled her scent. He's got fire, Silas offered, a hint of defensive pride mixed with warning. Fire's good, Cora murmured, her eyes never leaving the horse. Misplaced, maybe. She unlatched the corral gate and stepped inside, moving with a deliberate, unhurried confidence that made Silas's breath catch. Diablo snorted, backed up a step, then lowered his head slightly, eyeing her with suspicion. Silas tensed, hand instinctively moving towards the loop of rope hanging near the gatepost. This was folly. The horse was unpredictable, dangerous. Cora didn't approach directly. She stood for a long moment just inside the gate, letting the horse get used to her presence. She spoke softly, words Silas couldn't catch, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to settle the air. Then, slowly, she began to walk not towards Diablo, but along the perimeter of the corral, her steps measured and calm. Diablo watched her, his head turning to track her movement. The tension in his powerful frame seemed to ease, fraction by fraction. After completing a slow circuit, she stopped near the center, facing him. She held out her empty hand, palm down, not demanding, just offering. Silas held his breath. Diablo shifted his weight. He took one hesitant step forward, then another. He stretched his neck, snuffled cautiously at her fingers. Cora didn't move. The horse blew out a warm breath, then nudged her hand gently with his velvety muzzle. Silas watched, dumbfounded. He'd seen men wrestle this horse into submission, seen him buck and bite. He'd never seen him approach anyone. In one fluid motion, unhurried and devoid of any sudden threat, Cora lifted the coiled rope, not to throw it, but to let it hang loose by her side. She took a step closer to Diablo's shoulder. The horse stood firm, watching her, his earlier agitation replaced by a wary curiosity. Cora raised her free hand, slowly, and laid it gently on the crest of his neck, just behind his ears. She began to rub, a firm, steady stroke. Diablo let out a deep, shuddering sigh, his head lowering further, his eyes half closing. The transformation was astonishing. The raw, untamed energy was still there, banked now, like embers rather than a roaring flame. Silas stood frozen at the fence, the morning sun warming his back but doing nothing to dispel the chill of disbelief running through him. He'd hired her out of sheer, bone-deep desperation, expecting little bracing for failure or worse, injury. He'd prepared for skepticism, for awkwardness, for the inevitable proof that a woman couldn't handle the brutal realities of Iron Creek. He watched Cora Vance, her hand steady on the powerful horse that had defied every man who'd tried to master it. The horse stood quiet, accepting her touch. The silence stretched, filled only by the sigh of the wind and the soft sound of Cora's murmuring voice. Silas Thorne realized, with a jolt that felt like cold water, that he hadn't hired a stopgap. He might have just hired something else entirely, and he had absolutely no idea what that meant for him, for the ranch, or for the ghost that haunted them both. The quiet that followed Cora's taming of Diablo wasn't peaceful. It was a stunned silence after a lightning strike too close. Silas Thorne moved through the morning chores mechanically, the image of the powerful sorrel yielding to Cora's calm, touch replaying in his mind like a stubborn burr caught in his boot. He'd seen horse whisperers before, men who claimed a special bond, but this was different. It wasn't dominance. It was a quiet conversation he hadn't been privy to. He'd saddled Daisy, the reliable plotter, his leg protesting less than usual, perhaps numbed by the shock. He'd offered Diablo to Cora, a silent concession wrapped in gruffness. See if that understanding lasts under a saddle. She'd merely nodded, her expression unreadable. Now, riding north toward the broken fence line Cora had mentioned, Silas found his gaze constantly drawn back. Cora rode, Diablo a length behind, the horse stepping out with a high-headed alertness that was all energy, none of the previous malice. She sat the saddle like she was born to it, fluid and balanced, a part of the animal beneath her. It was unnerving. Women rode, sure, side saddle on placid mares for town visits. Not like this. Not astride a volatile gelding across the harsh, open range. It challenged something deep within him, a bedrock assumption about the order of things out here. He felt a prickle of unease, not just at her competence, but at the unsettling quiet she carried, a stillness that seemed to absorb the vast emptiness rather than be diminished by it. The land stretched before them, a sea of bleached grass and dust under the climbing sun. The wind, ever present, carried the scent of sage and dry earth. The silence between them wasn't companionable. It was thick with Silas's unspoken questions and Cora's guarded reserve. He pointed out a distant cluster of skeletal mesquite. Salt licks yonder. Fence runs east-west from there. Cora scanned the horizon, her gray eyes missing nothing. Ground's harder north, less grazed. Her observation was practical, devoid of small talk. She nudged Diablo into a smooth trot, effortlessly matching Daisy's slower pace. Silas watched the effortless communication between horse and rider. Diablo responded to the slightest shift of her weight, a touch of the rein, with an eagerness Silas had never inspired. It felt like a reproach. They reached the fence line near midday. Cora hadn't exaggerated. A long section lay flattened, posts splintered, wire tangled like a metallic bramble. It looked deliberate, not just weather damage. Silas dismounted stiffly, his bad leg protesting, and crouched by the wreckage. Rustlers, he muttered, the word tasting like bile. Cut it clean to drive strays out. Or scout. He ran a calloused hand over a severed wire end, sharp and clean. Recent. A fresh wave of helpless anger washed over him. Protecting miles of boundary with one aging rancher and a woman? It was laughable. He expected resignation, maybe a question about what to do next. Instead, Cora swung down from Diablo, landing lightly. She walked the length of the break, assessing the damage, the remaining posts, the tension of the surviving wire. She didn't speak, just absorbed the problem. Then, without a word, she walked back to her saddlebags and pulled out a pair of heavy leather gloves and a worn, but serviceable fencing tool, a hammer and wire clippers. Silas stared. Who carried fencing tools on a job-seeking ride? Posts here and hear her sound, she stated, pointing to two uprights flanking the worst damage. Wires salvageable if we splice. Need to reset these three. She gestured to the splintered posts, lying useless. Her voice was calm, analytical. She wasn't asking permission. She was formulating a plan. Silas felt a flicker of irritation at her presumption, quickly doused by the cold reality of the task. He couldn't do this alone, not quickly. He simply nodded, a curt jerk of his head. Tools are in the wagon shed. Was. He amended bitterly, remembering Jimmy Carter taking the ranch's small wagon into Clayton days ago and never returning. Spare posts might be there too, if the termites haven't finished him. Cora didn't react to the bitterness. We can cut green cedar from the draw half a mile west. Stronger anyway. She was already coiling the loose wire, her movements efficient, her hands knowing the bite of the metal, even through the gloves. Silas watched, the skepticism warring with a reluctant dawning of respect. She knew fencing, not just the theory, but the gritty, hand-blistering reality of it. Where had a woman learned that? The work was brutal under the relentless panhandle sun. Silas handled the axe, cutting and hauling the green cedar posts, his leg a constant, grinding ache. Cora worked alongside him, dragging posts, digging holes with a shovel she'd retrieved from the dilapidated line shack nearby. Another detail she'd noted on her approach. She swung the heavy sledgehammer with surprising power, driving the new posts deep into the unyielding earth, her braid coming loose, sweat plastering strands of dark hair to her temples and neck. She didn't complain, didn't pause except to wipe her brow with her sleeve. Silas found himself matching her pace, driven by a stubborn pride he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. It was hard, honest work, the kind that left your muscles trembling and your mind blessedly empty of ghosts, if only for a while. During a brief respite, leaning against a newly set post, Silas pulled a canteen from Daisy's saddle. The water was warm, tasting of canvas, but it was wet. He took a long swallow, then, almost as an afterthought, held it out towards Cora. She was wiping dirt from her gloves, breathing hard but steady. She looked at the canteen, then at him. A moment passed, the wind the only sound. Then she stepped forward, took it, and drank deeply. Not daintily, but with the thirst of hard labor. She handed it back, meeting his eyes briefly. Obliged. There was no smile, but a flicker of something. Acknowledgement, perhaps. Shared effort. Silas grunted, screwing the cap back on. He looked at the repaired section, taking shape. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong. Functional. Like her. He found himself asking, the question rough-edged but genuine. Where'd you learn to swing a hammer like that? And read a fence? Cora picked up the wire stretchers, her back to him as she hooked them onto the taut wire. Her pause was deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was low, carrying over the wind. Same place most learn anything out here. Necessity. She applied pressure, the wire singing as it tightened. Had a place. Once. Further south. Things changed. The finality in those two words was a slam door. She didn't elaborate, her focus entirely on the straining wire, her knuckles white on the handles. Silas didn't push. He knew about doors slammed shut by circumstance. The war, Martha's fever, the slow death of Iron Creek. He respected the silence that fell again, heavier now with the weight of unspoken histories. He grabbed the pliers and began twisting the splicing wire, the metal hot under his fingers. They worked side by side in that charged quiet, the rhythmic clink of tools and the sigh of the wind, their only accompaniment. The sun beat down, baking the earth, baking their resolve. It was nearing dusk when they finished the last splice. The fence stood straight and true again, a defiant line against the encroaching emptiness. Exhaustion pulled at Silas's bones, a deep weariness that went beyond the physical. But it was a different exhaustion than the soul-crushing fatigue he'd carried before Cora arrived. This felt earned. They watered the horses at a shallow, muddy seep near the salt lick, The main creek now just a memory of damp sand further east. As Diablo drank, head lowered, Cora crouched by the water's edge, her sharp eyes scanning the trampled mud. Silas watched her, curious. She traced a pattern with her finger, her brow furrowed. Then she froze. Slowly, she stood, holding up a small, twisted piece of metal Silas hadn't noticed. "Horseshoe nail," she said, her voice flat. "Fresh break. Not ours." She pointed to a cluster of hoof prints near the water, distinct from Daisy and Diablo's tracks. Shod horses, 4, maybe 5, came in from the west. She moved a few paces, her gaze sweeping the ground like a hawk's. "Stayed here a while. Watched the lick. Maybe the house." She picked up a crumpled twist of paper, cheap cigarette paper, left before dawn today. A cold dread, colder than the coming night, seeped into Silas's gut. Rustlers. Scouting. They knew the fence was down. They knew he was alone, or thought he was. The vulnerability of Iron Creek, of his dwindling herd, of his own solitary existence, crashed over him with renewed force. He looked at Cora, silhouetted against the dying light, the nail glinting dully in her hand. Her face was grim, her earlier stillness replaced by a focused intensity. She wasn't just a hand anymore. She was a witness to the threat. "We need to check the herd," Silas said, his voice tight. "See if they've taken anything yet." Cora nodded, already swinging up onto Diablo. "North pasture, where the green was." She gathered the reins, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon to the west, the direction the tracks had come from. The wind picked up, moaning through the newly repaired wire, carrying the smell of dust and something else, a tension as sharp as barbed wire. Silas mounted Daisy, pain shooting through his leg, forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. They rode hard towards the north pasture, the vast emptiness suddenly feeling like it held unseen eyes. The repaired fence was behind them, a small victory. But as they crested a rise, the dark shapes of the herd clustered below, barely visible in the twilight. Cora pulled Diablo up sharply. She pointed silently towards the far western edge of the gathered cattle. Silas squinted. Movement. Faint, fleeting shadows against the darker land. Not cattle. Riders. 3, maybe 4, skirting the edge of the herd, keeping to the low ground. Before Silas could speak, Cora leaned forward, her voice low and urgent, cutting through the wind and the sudden hammering of his own heart. "They're not scouting anymore, Mr. Thorne." Her gray eyes met his in the gathering gloom, reflecting the last bloody sliver of the setting sun. "They're moving in. Tonight." Cora's words hung in the cooling air, sharp as the tang of gun smoke. "Tonight." The shadows clinging to the western edge of the herd solidified into shapes for riders, moving with the predatory slowness of wolves circling prey. The vast panhandle night swallowed sound, making the rustlers' silent advance feel like a tightening noose. Silas's hand instinctively went to the Colt on his hip, the worn leather familiar, cold comfort. 5 against 2. 5 armed men against a crippled rancher and a woman whose true measure he was only beginning to grasp. The old fear, the Shiloh fear that tasted of mud and blood, surged in his throat. He expected panic, or at least hesitation. Instead, Cora Vance nudged Diablo closer, her voice a low, urgent rasp cutting through the wind's moan. "Can't fight him head-on. Not here. Need to move the herd." "Move him," Silas hissed, incredulous. "In the dark? Toward what? They'll just run him ragged, cut out what they want." The image of his already stressed cattle stampeding into the unseen dangers of the night, arroyos, badger holes, chilled him more than the rustlers. "Not stampede," Cora countered, her gaze fixed on the shadowy riders now angling to cut off the herd's easiest retreat south. "Just unsettle him, enough to buy time, shift the ground." She pointed northeast, toward the long, low ridge Silas knew well. "Fire breaks up there. Cleared last fall. Grass is thin, rocky, harder to run cattle through quietly. We push them towards it along the flank. Make the rustlers work uphill into the wind noise. Silas stared at her, using the land itself as a weapon, using the rustlers' own stealth against them. It was audacious, risky. It required knowing the terrain like the back of your hand and moving cattle with near supernatural calm in near darkness. He thought of Diablo, quiet under her hand. Thought of the fence posts driven deep without complaint. You think you can turn that herd? The question wasn't doubt, not entirely. It was all mixed with terror. Cora didn't answer with words. She simply gathered Diablo's reins, the big sorrel shifting eagerly beneath her, sensing the coiled tension. You take the near flank. Daisy's steady. Just keep M from bolting south. I'll push from the west, start the turn. When they feel the pressure uphill, they'll drift towards a break. Keep low, keep quiet. We're ghosts tonight, Mr. Thorne. With that, she touched her heels to Diablo's sides. Horse and rider melted into the deepening twilight. Not a gallop, but a swift, flowing trot that seemed to make no sound on the dry earth, angling wide to come up on the herd's western edge. Silas swallowed hard. The weight of her trust, or was it her command, settling on him? He nudged Daisy forward, the old mare responding with her usual placid obedience. He felt exposed, a dark shape against the slightly lighter sky. Below, the herd, a shifting, breathing mass of shadow, lowed softly, restless. He could see the rustlers now, closer, maybe 200 yards out, bunching up, preparing their push. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, deliberate steps of his horse. Ghost, she'd said. He felt like a target. Then from the west, a sound. Not a shout, not a whip crack. A low, ululating whistle, sharp and clear, cutting through the wind like a knife. It was a sound Silas had never heard before, part bird call, part Comanche signal he'd heard tales of. It echoed once, twice. The nearest cattle on the western edge jerked their heads up, snorting. The whistle came again, closer now, accompanied by the sudden, rhythmic thud of hooves. Not a charge, but a deliberate, driving cadence. Diablo materialized like a specter, Cora a darker shape atop him, moving parallel to the herd but closing in, her presence suddenly a palpable pressure on their flank. The cattle, already skittish from the lurking rustlers and the unnatural whistle, didn't bolt. They bunched, confused. Then, as Cora and Diablo pressed closer, their movement a relentless, contained energy, the front ranks began to turn. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, like water finding a new channel. They flowed away from the western pressure, away from the rustlers' approach, towards the higher, rockier ground to the northeast. Silas, jolted into action, urged Daisy forward on the southern flank, adding his own low, steady hi-ya, move on, to keep the drift cohesive, preventing a scatter southward. Daisy's bulk and familiar voice provided an anchor point the confused herd instinctively sought. Chaos erupted from the rustlers. Shouts, suddenly loud in the tense silence. Curses carrying on the wind. A gunshot cracked, a futile stab into the dark, aimed at nothing. They'd been outmaneuvered before they could strike. Their carefully planned ambush dissolved as the herd, now moving with purpose if not speed, streamed towards the firebreak ridge. The rustlers spurred their horses, trying to cut across, to intercept the flow, but they were forced uphill over rougher ground, their horses stumbling in the near darkness, their own noise panicking the cattle further and accelerating the movement Cora had initiated. Silas rode hard, his leg a white-hot brand of pain, clinging to Daisy's saddle horn, focusing on keeping the southern edge of the herd together. He lost sight of Cora in the swirling dust and gloom, only hearing the relentless driving beat of Diablo's hooves, the occasional sharp whistle that kept the cattle flowing northeast. It was like listening to a master musician conduct an orchestra of panic, shaping chaos into a desperate, life-saving retreat. The sheer, terrifying competence of it left him breathless. They reached the relative safety of the firebreak, a wide swath of bare earth and rock where last season's control burn had starved the current grass. The cattle, hemmed in by the ridge and the pressure from behind, milled anxiously but stopped their headlong drift. Silas reined Daisy in, gasping, sweat stinging his eyes, his body trembling with exertion and adrenaline. He scanned the darkness, searching for Cora. She emerged from the dust cloud like a wraith, Diablo blowing hard but controlled. She pulled up beside him, her face pale in the starlight, etched with fatigue, but her eyes blazing with fierce concentration. For a long moment, they just sat their horses, breathing hard, listening. The shouts of the frustrated rustlers carried from the lower ground to the west, growing fainter. They hadn't gotten a single head. "You," Silas began, his voice hoarse. "That whistle." "Comanche pony boy taught me," Cora said shortly, wiping her sleeve across her forehead. "Long time ago." She didn't elaborate, her gaze sweeping the perimeter of the nervous herd, then back towards the direction of the vanished rustlers. "They won't try again tonight. Too much noise, lost the advantage." She patted Diablo's sweat-darkened neck, a gesture of profound gratitude. The horse nudged her knee gently. Silas dismounted stiffly, his leg threatening to buckle. He leaned heavily against Daisy, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. The fear, the frantic ride, the shock of Cora's capability, it all crashed down. He fumbled for his canteen, hands shaking. He took a long pull, the water cold now in the night air, then held it out towards Cora. She swung down, took it, and drank deeply. In the shared silence, punctuated only by the cattle's restless lowing and the wind over the ridge, something passed between them. Not words, but a raw, unspoken recognition of the danger faced and overcome together. He saw the tremor in her hand as she lowered the canteen, the first crack in her stoic armor. She was human, after all, just capable beyond any measure he'd imagined. "We need to hold him here till light," Silas said, his voice steadier now. "Rotate watch." Cora nodded, handing back the canteen. Her gray eyes met his, reflecting the sparse starlight. "I'll take first. You're—" She paused, her gaze flicking briefly to his braced stance against Daisy. "You're spent." There was no judgment, only blunt fact. He couldn't argue. He hobbled to a flat rock, sinking onto it with a groan that was half pain, half profound relief. He watched Cora move Diablo to a vantage point overlooking the western approach, her silhouette alert against the sky. The trust he felt in her watchfulness was unsettling, profound. Who was she? The question burned brighter than ever. The night passed in stretches of eerie quiet and sudden tension as coyotes yipped or a nervous cow bawled. Silas dozed fitfully, images of shadowy riders and Cora's fierce, whistling charge mingling with older ghosts. At his watch, he relieved her, finding her sitting with her back against a boulder, eyes closed but not asleep, her rifle across her lap. The vulnerability in her posture, so different from her daytime competence, struck him deeply. He didn't speak, just took his post, the weight of the ranch, the mortgage, the rustler threat, and the enigma of Cora Vance pressing down under the vast, indifferent stars. Dawn broke, gray and hesitant, revealing the weary herd huddled on the firebreak and the vast, empty sweep of the plains to the west, scoured clean of rustlers for now. They drove the cattle slowly back towards the home pastures near the creek, the animals thirsty and exhausted. The familiar sight of the ranch buildings, bathed in the pale morning light, should have brought comfort. Instead, a new tension coiled in Silas's gut. A buggy stood near the house. A sleek black buggy hitched to a fine bay horse, utterly out of place in the dust of Iron Creek. Seated on the porch, looking impatient and impeccably dressed despite the hour and the setting, was Lemuel Tuttle, the banker from Amarillo. His sharp eyes missed nothing as Silas and Cora approached, driving the herd towards the corral. Tuttle's gaze lingered on Cora, taking in her trousers, the dust, the rifle strapped to Diablo's saddle, her obvious role in the cattle drive. His thin lips pursed in distaste. Silas dismounted, his legs screaming, and approached the porch, leaving Cora to settle the herd. Tuttle stood, brushing invisible dust from his tailored coat. "Thorne, out early. We're late." His voice was smooth as oiled leather, cold as a banker's vault. "Rustlers," Silas stated flatly, too tired for pleasantries. "Tried for the herd last night." Tuttle's eyebrows arched. "Tried? And failed? With?" He gestured vaguely towards Cora, who was efficiently opening the corral gate. "Assistance?" The skepticism dripped. "We held him off," Silas said, his voice hardening. He wouldn't let Tuttle diminish what Cora had done. "Not today." Tuttle didn't look convinced. "Well, holding off rustlers doesn't pay the interest, Silas. Nor does hiring unconventional help." He lowered his voice, though Cora was well out of earshot. "Word gets around. Clayton's buzzing. A woman dressing like a man, doing a man's work, it reflects poorly. On the ranch, on its creditworthiness." He let the implication hang. "My investors prefer stability. Tradition." Silas felt the old pressure, the vice of debt, tightening. "She's a good hand, Tuttle. The best I've had in years. Saved the herd last night." Tuttle waved a dismissive hand. "Be that as it may. My point stands. The next payment is due in 3 weeks. I trust you'll be focusing on solvent solutions, not distractions." He cast another disapproving glance towards Cora, who was now drawing water from the well, her movements economical, ignoring them completely. "See that you do, Silas. Good day." He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of courtesy, and climbed into his buggy, the fine wheels crunching on the gravel as he drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and renewed dread. Silas stood rooted, watching the buggy disappear. The rustler threat was real and immediate. Tuttle's pressure was a slower, more insidious poison. He turned wearily towards the corral. Cora had finished watering Diablo and was now unsaddling him. As she lifted the saddle off, a small, folded piece of paper, brittle and yellowed at the edges, fluttered from her saddlebag pocket and landed face down in the dust near the well. Silas moved to pick it up, a reflex. "Miss Vance, you dropped." Cora spun, faster than he'd ever seen her move. Her hand shot out, snatching the paper from his fingers before he could even register what it was. Her face, usually so composed, was pale, her eyes wide with something raw fear. Panic? She crumpled the paper in her fist, shoving it deep into her trouser pocket. "It's nothing," she said, her voice tight, strained. "Just trash." She wouldn't meet his eyes, turning back to Diablo with fierce concentration, her shoulders rigid. But Silas had seen, just for a split second, before her hand closed over it, the corner of a crude woodcut print. A face. And beneath it, a single, stark word in heavy, smudged type. "Wanted." The wanted poster burned in Silas Thorne's mind like a brand on hide. That single, smudged word, glimpsed for a heartbeat before Cora's hand snatched it away, hung heavier than the dust settling over Iron Creek. The morning sun climbed, harsh and unyielding, baking the corral where the cattle milled, their lowing a restless murmur. Silas stood by the well, his bad legs stiff from the night's ride, watching Cora brush Diablo with steady, deliberate strokes. Her face was a mask again, that fleeting panic from the night before buried deep. But Silas had seen it. Fear, not of rustlers, not of the dark, but of that brittle scrap of paper. Who was she running from? And why had she chosen his failing ranch to hide? He should have asked, should have demanded answers. A man didn't survive the panhandle by trusting strangers, especially ones with secrets that could bring trouble to his door. Yet he stayed silent, his calloused hands tightening on the well's rope as he hauled up a bucket. The water sloshed, murky and warm, a mirror to his churning thoughts. Cora was no ordinary hand. She'd turned a herd in the dark, outwitted rustlers, driven fence posts like she'd been born to it. But that poster, wanted, changed the shape of her presence. It wasn't just skill he was weighing now, it was risk. Cora didn't look at him as she finished with Diablo, tying the big sorrel to a post. She moved to the windmill, its blades creaking uselessly in the faint morning breeze. The pump, a stubborn relic of better days, had seized again, leaving the troughs dry. The cattle needed water, especially after last night's ordeal. Silas had meant to tackle it himself, but his leg throbbed, and the banker's visit gnawed at him. Lemuel Tuttle's words, stability, tradition, creditworthiness, felt like a noose tightening around Iron Creek. 3 weeks until the next payment. 3 weeks to prove the ranch wasn't a lost cause. And now this woman, this enigma, was tangled up in it all. Cora crouched by the pump, her hands probing the rusted bolts with the same calm focus she'd given the fence. She found a battered toolbox in the line shack yesterday, and now she wielded a wrench with practiced ease, loosening the casing. Silas limped over, his shadow falling across her. "You know pumps too?" His voice came out gruffer than intended, laced with the unease he couldn't shake. She didn't pause, her fingers deft on the metal. Seen enough break to know how to fix him. Her tone was flat, deflecting. She pried off the casing, revealing a tangle of corroded gears and a cracked piston. "This one's been neglected too long. Needs a new rod, but I can patch it for now. Get water flowing by noon." Silas grunted, half impressed, half irritated. "You always this sure of yourself." She glanced up, her gray eyes steady, unreadable. "Only when I know what I'm doing." She turned back to the pump, dismissing the question. Silas watched her work, the sun glinting off the sweat on her brow, her braid fraying under the strain of the morning's labor. She moved like the land itself, unyielding, precise, shaped by necessity. He wanted to trust that, wanted to believe she was just a hand, not a fugitive bringing trouble. But the poster's shadow loomed. They worked through the morning, Silas fetching spare parts from the barn, a bent rod, a jar of grease thickened by time, while Cora dismantled the pump with surgical care. She didn't ask for help, but she didn't refuse his either. Their hands brushed once, passing a wrench, and Silas felt a jolt, not unlike the shock of her whistle in the dark. Her fingers were rough, calloused, a working woman's hands, but there was a steadiness in them that made his own feel clumsy. He pulled back, focusing on the task, the clank of metal and the creak of the windmill filling the silence. By noon, the pump sputtered to life. Water trickled, then surged into the troughs, a thin but steady stream. The cattle crowded forward, their thirsty bellows softening to contented snorts. Cora stood, wiping her hands on her trousers, her face smudged with grease but calm. Silas nodded, a grudging acknowledgement. "Good work," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She'd saved his herd last night, patched his pump today. What next? Cora didn't respond, her gaze drifting to the horizon, where the plains shimmered under the heat. "Need to check the east pasture," she said. "Rustlers might have left sign. Tracks, anything to tell us who they are." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Silas caught the edge beneath it. She was searching for something, maybe not just rustlers. He hesitated. The east pasture was a long ride, and his leg was a dull fire. But Tuttle's warning echoed. Distractions, creditworthiness. Cora was both, and neither. "I'll ride with you," he said, surprising himself. "Need to know what we're up against." They saddled up, Diablo and Daisy moving with weary purpose. The ride was silent, the sun beating down, the air thick with dust and the faint, sour smell of parched grass. The east pasture was a sprawling expanse, dotted with mesquite and crisscrossed by shallow gullies. Cora rode ahead, her eyes scanning the ground like a tracker. Silas followed, His thoughts split between the rustlers and that crumpled paper. Wanted. For what? Theft? Murder? Or something less clear, like the ghost that haunted his own past? They found the sign near a dry creek bed. Tracks, fresh enough to hold their shape in the loose soil. Shod hooves, 3 sets, veering south toward the low-rise. Cora, dismounted, crouching to study the marks. "Same as the lick," she said, her voice low. "They're circling, testing." She picked up a broken twig, its end charred. Campfire. Sloppy. They're bold, but not careful. Silas felt the dread return, colder now. "They'll come back," he said. "More of them, maybe." Cora nodded, her expression grim. "They know you're short-handed. 1 man, 1 ranch." She paused, then corrected herself. 2. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. 2. Not just a hand, but a partner in this fight. Silas looked at her, really looked. Her face was sun-browned, her eyes sharp but tired, carrying a weight he couldn't name. He wanted to ask about the poster, to demand the truth. Instead, he said, "You've done more than most men would, Cora." "What?" She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her gaze fixed on the tracks. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything." Her voice was quiet, raw, the first crack in her armor since the poster. "This place, it's not just yours. It's a chance. For both of us." Silas's throat tightened. He thought of Martha, fevered and fading in the ranch house bed. The war, the blood, the dreams that died in Georgia mud. A chance. He hadn't thought in those terms in years. Before he could respond, Cora turned, mounting Diablo with that fluid grace that still startled him. "Let's head back," she said. "Need to fortify the corral before night." They rode in silence, the weight of her words settling like dust. Back at the ranch, they reinforced the corral gate, hammering new braces into the weathered wood. The work was grueling, the sun unrelenting, but they moved as a unit, their rhythm unspoken but sure. As they finished, Silas noticed a small, carved wooden charm hanging from Cora's saddlebag, half hidden by a strap. A bird crudely shaped, its wings worn smooth by time. He didn't ask about it, but he saw her fingers brush it once, a fleeting, reverent touch. Dusk fell, painting the sky in bruised purples. They sat on the porch, sharing a tin of cold coffee, the silence between them softer now, less burdened. Silas broke it first. "My wife, she loved this place. Said it was where the sky breathed free. Wanted to plant roses by the well." He paused, the memory sharp. Never got to it. Cora's eyes met his, steady, understanding. "My brother carved that bird," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before he left." She didn't elaborate, but the shared confession felt like a bridge, fragile but real. The moment was broken by hoofbeats. Not the rustler's stealth, but the steady clip of a single rider. A boy, no older than 16, reined up, his face flushed from a hard ride. "Mr. Thorne," he panted, clutching a crumpled letter. "From Clayton. Sheriff's deputy sent me. Found a man in the scrub, shot dead. One of them rustlers, they think. Had this on him." He handed Silas the letter. It was sealed, addressed to Iron Creek, but the paper was torn, revealing a corner of text inside. Silas's eyes caught one word, stark against the smudged ink: Vance. Cora froze, her coffee tin clattering to the porch. Her gray eyes locked on the letter, wide with something deeper than fear, recognition. Silas's hand tightened on the paper, his heart pounding. The boy stared, oblivious. "Sheriff's coming tomorrow," he said. "Want to talk." "About her." The letter in Silas Thorne's hand felt heavier than the Colt on his hip. Vance. The name, stark and smudged, stared back from the torn paper, a silent accusation that cut through the morning's quiet. The boy from Clayton had ridden off, leaving dust and dread in his wake. The sheriff was coming. Today. Cora Vance stood by the corral, her back to Silas, her hand still on Diablo's reins. The carved bird charm swayed from her saddlebag, catching the pale dawn light. She hadn't spoken since the boy's departure, but her silence was louder than the wind that moaned across Iron Creek's parched plains. Silas's gut twisted. He'd seen her face when she glimpsed the letter, recognition, fear, a crack in her iron resolve. Whoever she was, whatever she'd done, it was catching up. He should have confronted her, demanded the truth about the wanted poster, the letter, the name that now hung between them like a storm cloud. But the memory of her whistle in the dark, her steady hands on the windmill pump, the raw confession about her brother, they held him back. Cora wasn't just a hand. She was a lifeline, pulling Iron Creek from the brink. And maybe, just maybe pulling him too. He folded the letter, tucking it into his vest, and limped toward the house. "Coffee's on," he said, his voice rough. "We'll talk when the sheriff gets here." Cora nodded, her gray eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first rays of sun bled gold into the dust. "I'll tend the herd," she said, her voice steady but distant. She mounted Diablo and rode toward the north pasture, her silhouette sharp against the dawn. Silas watched her go, the weight of the letter pressing against his chest. He didn't know what the sheriff would bring, but he knew one thing. Cora Vance was no ordinary fugitive, and he wasn't ready to lose her. The morning passed in a haze of chores, the ranch's endless demands a distraction from the looming confrontation. Silas mended a broken harness, the leather stiff under his fingers, while his thoughts churned. Lemuel Tuttle's warning echoed. 3 weeks until the next payment, a deadline that could choke Iron Creek into foreclosure. The rustlers, though driven off, were still out there, circling like vultures. And now the sheriff, with questions about Cora. Silas's bad leg throbbed, a reminder of battles fought and lost. He'd survived Shiloh, survived Martha's death, survived the slow bleed of this ranch. But this, trusting a woman with a shadowed past, felt like a new kind of war. Cora returned at noon, her face smudged with dust, her trousers streaked with mud from checking the creek bed. She'd found no new rustler signs, but her eyes were wary, scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to ride in with the heat. They ate in silence, cornbread and beans on the porch, the tin plates clinking softly. Silas watched her, searching for a hint of the panic he'd seen last night. She was calm now, but it was the calm of a coiled spring ready to snap. He wanted to ask about the poster, the letter, her brother. Instead, he said, "You fixed more than that pump yesterday. Kept this place breathing." Cora's fort paused, her gaze meeting his. "It's a good place," she said softly. "Worth saving." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Silas's throat tighten. He thought of Martha's roses, unplanted, and the bird charm on Cora's saddlebag. Worth saving. For the first time in years, he believed it might be. The sheriff arrived in the early afternoon, his bay gelding kicking up dust as he reined up by the well. Amos Cutler was a broad man, weathered by sun and years, his badge glinting dully on his vest. He dismounted, his eyes flicking from Silas to Cora, who stood by the corral, her hand resting on Diablo's neck. "Thorne," Cutler said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "Got a matter needs straightening." He held up a folded paper, its edges worn, the word wanted visible even from a distance. Silas's heart sank. He stepped forward, his bad leg dragging slightly. "Let's hear it, Amos." Cutler glanced at Cora, his expression unreadable. "Found a body in the scrub south of Clayton. One of them rustlers, we reckon. Shot clean through. Had this on him." He unfolded the paper, revealing a crude woodcut of a young woman's face, sharp cheekbones, gray eyes, a braid. Cora Vance. Below the text, wanted. Cora Vance. Theft. $200 reward. Issued in San Angelo, 1871. Cora didn't flinch, but Silas saw her hand tighten on Diablo's reins, the knuckles whitening. "Theft," Silas said, his voice sharp. "What kind?" Cutler sighed, folding the poster. "Cattle. 30 head from a spread down south. Owner swore it was her and a man, maybe your kin. Never caught him. Never found the cattle. He studied Cora. You got anything to say, miss? Silas expected denial, defiance, anything but what came. Cora stepped forward, her chin high, her voice steady. It was my brother, Caleb. He was 16. Desperate. Our pa died, left us nothing but debt. The rancher down in San Angelo, McAllister, cheated us out of our land. Said we owed him. Caleb took those cattle to settle the score. I helped him drive him. Didn't know he'd die for it. Her eyes were dry, but her voice cracked on the last word, a wound laid bare. Silas stared, the pieces falling into place. The bird charm, her skill with cattle, with horses. The way she'd fought for Iron Creek like it was her own. Not a fugitive running from guilt, but a woman carrying it. He turned to Cutler. She saved my herd last night, Amos. Outsmarted those rustlers. She's worth more to this place than any $200 bounty. Cutler rubbed his jaw, considering. McAllister's dead. Fever took him last year. His kin don't care about the bounty no more. But the law's the law. I need to take her to Clayton, sort this proper. Cora's face didn't change, but Silas saw the flicker of resignation in her eyes. She'd faced worse than a cell, he realized. She'd faced loss, betrayal, the kind of loneliness that mirrored his own. She ain't going nowhere, Silas said, his voice low, firm. This is her place now. You want her, you'll have to go through me. Cutler's eyebrows rose, but a faint smile tugged at his mouth. Reckon I'd rather not tangle with Iron Creek's stubbornest cuss. He tucked the poster into his vest. I'll tell the judge it's settled. But keep her out of trouble, Silas. And watch your back. Those rustlers ain't done. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off, leaving a silence thick with relief and unspoken questions. Cora didn't move, her gaze fixed on the dust trail. You didn't have to do that, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Did not, Silas replied. He limped to the well, pulling up a fresh bucket. He splashed water on his face, the cold grounding him. You're worth more than a bounty, Cora. To this ranch. He stopped, the words catching. To me. He didn't say it, but her eyes met his, and he knew she'd heard it anyway. That evening, they sat by the corral, the sky ablaze with stars. The cattle were calm, the wind soft for once. Silas handed her a small, wrapped bundle. Martha's rose seeds, saved from years ago, found in a dusty tin. Thought you might plant 'em, he said. By the well, like she wanted. Cora took the bundle, her fingers brushing his. She didn't speak, but her hand lingered, warm and steady. For the first time, Silas felt the ghosts of Iron Creek loosen their grip. Days later, the rustlers struck again. A midnight raid, bolder, more desperate. But this time, Silas and Cora were ready. They'd reinforced the corral, set traps in the gullies, and rallied the few remaining hands from Clayton. Cora's whistle cut the night. Diablo a storm beneath her, and Silas, bad leg and all, rode Daisy with a fire he hadn't felt since Shiloh. They drove the rustlers off, scattering them into the dark, the herd safe, Iron Creek standing tall. Weeks passed, and the ranch began to breathe again. The creek, fed by a late rain, trickled stronger. The rose seeds sprouted by the well, fragile green against the dust. Cora stayed, her name cleared, her place unquestioned. Silas never asked her to marry him, not with words. But one morning, as they rode the north pasture together, he carved his initials beside hers on a cedar post, a quiet vow etched in wood. The wind carried the scent of roses, and for the first time, Iron Creek felt like home.